Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. We're going to start today with just some remarks from our sponsor. We have Emily here, or Erin here. Sorry, I'm thinking about your name all day. Erin, come on up. She's with Community Preservation Corporation, and they helped support this. They support Up for Growth, and they helped to support this panel. So I want to give her a moment to give some remarks, and then we'll get started. Thanks, Erin.
Thank you so much. So my name is Erin Burnsmain. I'm Chief of Staff and Vice President of Policy for CPC, the Community Preservation Corporation. We're the largest community development finance institution in the country that's solely focused on multifamily. We have $14 billion in the market. Sorry, I don't want to block anyone. And we finance just under 230,000 units of housing. We are proud to sponsor Up for Growth and very excited about the panel today. Could not come a moment too soon, I think, to hear from three communities about some challenges and some solutions for underproduction. So without further ado, I think, should I turn it to the moderator? Should I turn it to Sarah? Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I can just speak. Oh, my microphone magically works. How cool is that? Hi, everybody. I'm Sarah Watson. I'm the Interim Executive Director of Citizens Housing and Planning Council of New York. We're a think tank focused on housing policy and planning in New York City. We focus on the 5 boroughs. I'm originally from London, hence my weird combo accent. If people are sitting there thinking, is she Australian? Can't place it. So happy to be here today. We have an amazing panel, really diverse set of perspectives on the issue of underproduction. Arthur C. Nelson, who goes by Chris, is here. He's the professor of planning and real estate development at the University of Arizona. He's written extensively about housing crises, best practices in policy. He's really focused on housing options for diverse household types, like single seniors. We're going to hear about his work and the states he thinks are doing the best job to try and counter these issues. Becca Davis is here. She's the executive director of the Coalition for Home Repair. It's a fascinating group promoting the preservation of safe, healthy, affordable housing by supporting the work of home repair and rehabilitation partners nationwide. A substantial driver of underproduction is the issue about repairs. We're going to hear from a presentation from Becca about her work. And Linda Mandolini is the president of Eden Housing, which is a nonprofit affordable housing developer based in the Bay Area, focuses on energy conservation and sustainable development. So we're really going to be using the amazing Up for Growth report on underproduction as the jumping off point today. If you haven't read it, definitely do so. And I want to thank Up for Growth so much for doing this important work and filling in so many of the gaps of data and really promoting this issue nationwide. It's so needed. We've been trying to work on this stuff for 15 years, at least at CHPC. We have a chronic underproduction problem in New York City. And it's really extraordinary to have such a great report. Just a few little pieces if you haven't read their report. So in 2012, 100 metro areas were experiencing underproduction, and in 2019, 169. So it's more than doubled, reaching a deficit of 3.8 million needed homes across 57 states and DC. And the drivers of underproduction are very unique to location. So it includes chronic disinvestment, structural changes in industry, bankruptcy have resulted in uninhabitable units. There's also major supply constraints, often the result of exclusionary zoning, complicated housing regulations, cost of land, materials, labor, availability of financing. And then there's also an issue of that Chris will talk about, I believe, is about sort of the missing households. We're not really seeing the demand for housing out there because people then double up and they get hidden within the home. And so it's sort of difficult for supply to keep up with demand in that way. So there's such an array of reasons, of drivers, and I think it's extraordinary we get panelists who can speak to all those different drivers, but also to have the academic and the practitioner and the nonprofit group represented is going to be exciting. So I think, first of all, we're going to hear some presentations on their work, and then we'll have a little discussion. And I believe that Chris's presentation is first.
Right.
So please introduce yourself a little more and we'll hear from Chris.
Hi, I'm Chris Nelson. I'm a professor, which means I have a PowerPoint. And I wasn't too sure about the time. I was told I was given 2 or 3 hours to work with.
Can we get a 20-minute? Is it 20 minutes each?
I think it's 10 minutes
10?
each.
Okay.
But mind you,
Should
my,
we give you a little-
my student some years ago gave me the Nobel Prize. Think about it. Okay, I'm going to talk about mostly the West, some national perspectives and also the West. But first, I want to show you the house that we had here in Alexandria during the 2000s. This was built in the 1920s as a threeplex, was occupied as a threeplex until the 1970s, reverted to a single-family home. We bought it in 2002, but it's pre-approved by Alexandria to go back to a threeplex. Now, this particular house is on, if you know Alexandria at all, this is Commonwealth and Walnut. This particular street and the next one, north and southeast and west, could be called a middle housing area. Kitty corner from our house is a 16-plex. Next door neighbors were duplexes across the street and next to us. And so we had the variety that was in the book called Missing Middle Housing, written by Dan Perolick. I was the with author. I did the chapter on demographic demand for middle housing. And I've updated those numbers. We need to update the book. Between now and 2050, if every new home built or converted to make a new unit were in a middle housing situation, every home between now and 2050, we still wouldn't meet the current demand for middle housing around the U.S. So I mentioned earlier, that we had a study that came out in July, housing underproduction in the U.S. These are the numbers for the West, all the western states. Now the nation, we underproduced by about 34% between 2012 2019. We produced about a third fewer homes than we needed to meet housing demand. Housing demand is the formula on the left-hand side. Existing households plus missing households, the millennials who are staying at home too long, and maybe now the Gen Zers, units without kitchens or bathrooms, normal vacant units, and the units that had to be replaced. So that's the housing demand side. So we found across the nation we fell short about 3.8 million homes. In the West, it was pretty much the same, about 1/3 undershooting except for California. No big surprise to anybody, 60% in California. And I show some other states too. We look at metropolitan areas on the next slide here. And again, except for the California cities, the West was a little above or below the national average. So pretty much on target. But again, California is its own outlier. And I'll talk about California, what they're trying to be doing, what they're doing eventually. Metropoly, okay. Now, I want to talk about very important demographic changes. Between 1980 and 2010, 75% of the net change in demand for housing was to meet the needs of what I call peak housing households. Those are between 35 and 64. Parents, kids, dogs, cats, they want a bigger house, they want a bigger yard. That's the peak housing time frame of the life cycle. Between 2010 and 2040, 77% of the net change in housing demand will be for downsizing, empty nesting households. That's a fundamental change. And we're in the beginning of that now. And our housing is already showing, in my perspective, a mismatch between increasing demand and decreasing supply to meet the downsizing part of the spectrum. And what are we looking at between peak housing and downsizing characteristics? Obviously, larger homes versus smaller homes, larger lots versus smaller lots. Separation and isolation versus security. And drivability, isolation, which goes with isolation, and walkability, accessibility. So the fundamental needs for the downsizing household are very different from the needs of the peak housing household, and that era is gone. That is never going to come back, by the way. We look at the housing space consumed by people at different age groups, running from 475 square feet per person under 25 to double that for those people who are over 65 years and older. So this is a trend that we're seeing, I think, as an opportunity in the country. Now, this particular chart, it's somehow garbled. This is from the Pew Foundation. Every so often they do what's called a multi-generational household study. And I ran the numbers back to 1900, by the way. In 1900, 24% of all Americans lived in multi-generational households, defined as households comprised of 2 or more generations, excluding kids. Unless the kids come back from school, then they become part of the 2 generations. The 24%-ish relationship held through World War II up to 1950, and then collapsed down to about 12% in 1980 as Americans living in multi-generational households. We've been inching up since, and I project that we'll have 28% of Americans living in multi-generational households by 2040. And what does that mean? That means more demand for doubling up, tripling up in existing housing units, hence the growing demand for accessory dwelling units and such. I did a study. A builder asked me to look at, and I don't know what happened to the slides. This is a strange color combination. A builder in Salt Lake City asked me to look at the missing people. We talk about missing housing, missing middle housing. What about the missing people? I looked at an area called the Avenues, which is above the Capitol building in Salt Lake City, between the Capitol building and the University of Utah. It's an older area. Between 2000 and 2018, it lost about 7% of the population. But basically, we would need to add 300 new residential units to the upper avenues to rebalance the population in that part of Salt Lake City. But there's something more fundamental. Those 300 housing units will be built somewhere. Will they be built in the suburban areas requiring new water, new sewer, new roads, and the rest of it? Or could we put the 300 housing units where they're needed to serve the missing people, and we already have the water, and we have the sewer, and the roads already there? So it's a matter of fiscal balance as well. I looked at Phoenix. That's big. I'm in Tucson, Arizona now, University of Arizona. Phoenix is the big gorilla up the highway from us, actually down the hill from us, technically, when you look at elevations. So in 1985, in Phoenix, of those homes with 2,000 square feet or more, they averaged 3.3 persons per home. In 2019, that fell down to 2.7 persons per home, homes over 2,000 square feet. What if we rebalance the population living in homes over 2,000 square feet in Phoenix to be like they were in 1985? We would accommodate 280,000 people, or about 18% of the future growth in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Or in looking at the senior population, by adding more capacity in existing homes, that would allow for the equivalent of half of the population change of those over 65. And I talked about this earlier. In Phoenix, if we were able to move 100,000 people who were going to be moving into the city or the metropolitan area anyway, into existing housing units, ADUs or such, we could save $1 billion in infrastructure costs. $1 billion is real money. We talk a lot about plexes, a duplex, threeplex, fourplex. I looked at the numbers between 1999 and 2019. In 1999, 10.7% of all residential units were plexes. That fell down to 7.6% by 2019. If you look at the bottom there, we're missing 3.8 million homes in the underproduction study. What if we had the same percent distribution in 1999 in plexes as we in 2019, assuming we had more duplexes, threeplexes, fourplexes, and so forth, we would have made up the difference. Had we been more flexible in allowing plexes between 1999 and 2019, we might not have had the housing underproduction that we see. So what are states doing? Oregon is doing something very interesting. They basically have what they call a middle housing statute. It applies to all cities over 25,000 people, which is basically all places of consequence in Oregon. And they have to provide or allow by right, duplex, threeplex, fourplex, townhouse, and you see the list here. They have to require, the zoning codes have to be changed to allow these by right. Utah, spent some years at the University of Utah. The state there, about the reddest state in the union, the legislature last year, 2021, passed a law that it's a by right accessory dwelling unit statute. And unlike other states like California, Oregon, or Minneapolis, the city, or Seattle, other places, this is not only just by right, it supersedes CC&Rs and HOAs. So this will be interesting for us to follow. California, excuse me, has for much of the 2010s been working on allowing ADUs by right. Excuse me. And these days, is that clean water? Yeah. Pardon me. I thought we had dry air in Tucson. Or maybe it's my hot air. So California runs about 20,000 by right ADUs per year because of the laws passed during the 2010s. And 20,000 a year is not a whole lot for California, but when you run out the numbers, if you're looking between now and say mid-century, those are hundreds of thousands of units that are going to be coming online. And the industry is so efficient that you can take your own property on a map, download it, and choose from a menu of by right ADUs to put on your property. That's how slick the California system has become. Last year, California had passed a law allowing by right property splits to create a deeded duplex to create more affordable housing in that state. And earlier this year, California legislature, I think the governor has not signed it yet, has passed a by right commercial strip redevelopment opportunity for multifamily housing on basically commercial retail asphalt plots of land. So if you're going to go into the business statewide or citywide or whatever in terms of expanding your housing choices in single-family residential areas, you need to ask yourselves, what are you going to allow? ADUs only in Utah, or tiny homes as Seattle does, or plexes, if so how many? Minneapolis has up to three units. A deeded plex, as California has. A single-room occupancy, which I have not quite seen yet, but that's probably on the horizon. Where statewide, or particular cities, or targeted areas. How do you address parking? Parking is an overblown concern, but it is real in some situations, but it's typically overblown. And what about fees? In Tucson, where we have a by right casita ordinance, we still charge impact fees and water connection fees for the new casitas being built, and that's a $20,000 cash out of your own pocket bill. And we're surprised why the casita policy isn't really taking off. Well, what's happening here? In most parts of Tucson where places where these casitas would be built already have the water and the sewer and so forth available. All we're doing is rebalancing those neighborhoods back to the population they used to have. So maybe we should identify the neighborhoods where all we're doing is, through the casita policy, repopulating neighborhoods, and then waive the water fees and the impact fees. And then what's the process? Over the counter or a hearing? And that's my presentation. I'll take questions, I guess, later on afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. And we're going to hear from Becca Davis about the Coalition for Home Repairs work.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I I think sometimes we have a lot of silos even within affordable housing, and I am in the housing preservation side, which I find doesn't talk to the affordable housing production side enough. So that's why I think this is a really important conversation to have. I heard Chris was going to have slides, so I had to throw in a few, but I'm not a professor, so I'm not going to stand up. So the Coalition for Home Repair is a network of over 100 nonprofits that work all over the country to preserve single-family owner-occupied homes. Our coalition includes some Habitat affiliates, some Rebuilding Together affiliates, but it's mostly independent, community-based nonprofits. We're essentially the trade association for those folks, so we provide education, resources, we do some advocacy. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. I just wanted to share a little bit about why we feel like our work is so important. A lot of people think of affordable housing as only vouchers or rental assistance or the newly constructed homes with low interest loans, but we believe that home repairs and modifications are a really important part of the solution to the housing crisis. And part of that is because repairs are one of the most affordable housing solutions. There's a great report from the researcher at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and they found that there's about 9 million low-income renter households that have significant repair needs, and about 6.6 million low-income homeowner households that need repairs. And the cost to repair all of those is just extremely high. But home preservation is, for many folks, millions of folks, the best and most affordable housing option, especially when there's a nonprofit like one of our coalition members who is doing the repairs. We know that building new homes won't completely solve the crisis. For every new affordable unit that's built, 2 others are lost to abandonment, deterioration, or conversion to more expensive housing, and that's according to the Urban Land Institute and NeighborWorks. And it costs about 26 times less to repair an existing affordable home than it does to build a new one. There are just so many homes that are substandard that really urgently need fixing. The American Housing Survey tells us there's about 6 million homes that are substandard in the United States, and the Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University reports that the median age of the U.S. housing stock has increased. In 2007, the median age was 24 years, and then in 2019, the median age is 41 years. So the housing stock is getting older. And of course, older homes need more repairs than newer homes. About half of all homes built before 1940 need significant repairs. And a third of all occupied homes in the U.S. have structural, plumbing, electrical, heating problems, leaks, pest infestations, and that doesn't even include homes that have indoor air and water quality issues, lead contamination. We could go on. And most substandard homes are occupied by people who need physical or financial assistance to repair their homes. And of course, the pandemic resulted in even more people needing assistance. The cost of lumber products increased by nearly 500% in 1 year. It just became unattainable to repair your own home if you were low income. But a few more reasons why we think home repairs are really important. We believe that home repair is a form of health care, and housing as a form of health care is becoming a more and more popular hot topic. The CDC has identified investing in home repairs for low-income households as a high-impact strategy for addressing the root causes of poor health. We know that home repairs and modifications allow people with disabilities and veterans, older adults, to avoid institutional care and to stay in their own homes. And we know that aging in place is the preference for most people. Health is so greatly impacted by housing that every $1 spent on urgent home repairs can save $19 in Medicare and Medicaid costs, according to the North Carolina Housing Finance Agency. And more of our members are finding great experience partnering with local hospital systems where the emergency department will fund the building materials for a ramp because it is cheaper to have the nonprofit build the ramp than to see the same older adult return time and time again to their emergency room. And so, of course, the cost of housing-related health hazards measures in the tens of billions annually, but repairing homes not only improves the occupants' physical and mental health, but it saves all of us taxpayers money as well. And we know that home repairs improve communities. There's some great recent studies that came out. There was a report from the University of Pennsylvania that showed that in Philadelphia, home repairs resulted in a 22% reduction in total crime, and that the number of units repaired directly correlated with the decreased crime. We know that investing in repairs can prevent homes from falling into severe disrepair, which of course makes them at risk of property abandonment, which can lead to overall community decline. And just in general, when a low-income home is repaired, the property value increases, which benefits the entire neighborhood. So we believe that restoring homes really is an important key to restoring vibrant communities nationwide. Just briefly, overall, our coalition members have repaired more than 50,000 homes since our organization started. Just last year, it was about 10,000 homes. We partner with nonprofits, with businesses, governments, and our members complete all sorts of projects, everything from ranging from those accessibility ramps to roof repairs to building on bedroom and bathroom additions. And most of our members utilize volunteers to complete the repairs. Some are what I call the camp model. We have, a mission trip group comes in for a week at a time. Others use local volunteers. Some have carpenters on staff. Some hire subcontractors to complete repairs. And the number of residents that our members have served since we began is inching up and upward. We've helped over 36,000 older adults, 24,000 people living with disabilities, 5,000 children, more than 3,000 veterans. And all this work was made possible by more than 344,000 volunteers serving millions of hours. I want to share very briefly one quick case study. I live in Northeast Tennessee, but we have members all over the country, and I wanted to highlight Rebuild Upstate, which is one of our members in South Carolina. Rebuild Upstate began in 2006 when Clemson University students saw the need to continue disaster relief and rebuilding work in New Orleans. And then in 2007, they received a request to repair a home locally in Greenville, South Carolina, and so they did. And today, Rebuild Upstate repairs homes exclusively in the upstate of South Carolina. The nonprofits repaired over 1,300 homes with the help of over 9,000 volunteers. And since they became a coalition member, they've had a lot of great successes. They figured out how to use some federal funding by partnering with municipalities. They've gotten their first federal grant. They've received numerous awards for their best practices and volunteer management. I just have a quick quote to share from Jake Beatty, who's their executive director. He says, "Our growth wouldn't have happened as fast or been as streamlined without the Coalition for Home Repair. The Coalition serves a niche industry and provides a proving ground for ideas and frameworks that work, or don't, for other organizations that walk and talk like our own. We focused growth on areas that had the greatest return on investment within a support system and access to continuing education. Membership in the Coalition accelerated growth to create the success that we have today." And my last slide here is just a really quick overview of what we provide. We offer some grants to our members. We are a dues-based organization, but our members, I think last year, received on average 5 times financially back as compared to what their dues that they paid to us. We do some advocacy, mostly focusing on 2 USDA programs, the 504 home loan and grant program, and then the 533 housing preservation grants. We have affinity groups and cohorts. We have an anti-racism community of practice, a local model cohort, a faith-based group. We have a fundraising boot camp, an aging in place cohort. And so we just find all sorts of ways to connect people to figure out how to do what we do better. And all sorts of educational resources as well. And just again, really glad to be here and to have housing preservation be part of this conversation. Happy to connect with anybody who's interested in repairing homes for low-income households. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Linda Mandolini is going to talk about the work of Eden Housing in California.
Sure. So thank you for having me. It's very exciting to be here. I did read the report that Up for Growth wrote, and I have one small quibble. The state of California actually believes we need 3.5 million housing units to keep pace with our demand. So when we look at the numbers in California, we think we need 1.4 million affordable units alone to keep pace with where we're going to be. And so I'm going to give you all a little quiz. We'll have some audience participation since it's late. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to free associate for my 10 minutes. So how many people do we think live in California? Beth, you live there. You should know.
40-ish million.
40-ish million, that's good. How many people do we think live in Canada? 38 million. We're close. You're very close. So they're roughly the same population, maybe not quite the same land mass, although we are quite big. How many homes do you think we permitted in California in 2021 that actually constructed?
13.
Close, 13 actually. 112,000. How many homes do you think Canada built in 2021?
6 million.
No, not quite that good. 296,000. So they built 3 times the number of housing units in Canada that we built in California. We are in such a deep hole in California that it's going to take everything and then some to dig us out. In my free time, I chair the policy committee of the California Housing Consortium, which recently passed AB 20, or got AB 2011 to the governor's desk, which is the, yes, thank you, the conversion bill for commercial land. But we've done a lot of work in the last few years. I just want to tell you a little story. You know, Eden is a nonprofit that's been in business since 1968. We got our start with a group of volunteers who went to work on a ballot initiative for open housing, which today we call fair housing. It failed. My board chair at the time was the coach of one of the first integrated basketball teams in California, and he was really trying to figure out how to get his players housing. And so after the ballot initiative failed, he and the 5 others on our board said, well, we're not going to quit. So they adopted 6 families, did a Habitat for Humanity style house build. And that was our first project. And then they built 150 units for seniors, which we still own. They did that in '72. And today we own 11,000 units statewide, from San Diego in the south to Sacramento in the northeast. We work a lot in small cities and communities of opportunity, which is HUD's new definition for communities with really good school systems and very big NIMBYs. So that's just my shorthand for what this is like. And I just want to tell you a story because it really resonated for me. We built 150 homes at a BART station with a very famous football player as our partner, Joe Montana. You may know his name from the 49ers. And I'll never forget, we had the grand opening. We had 150 homes, 50 for seniors, 100 for families. We had 4,500 applications for those homes. And at the opening, we had a senior speak, and her name was Annie. And I won't ever forget Annie's story because she stood up at the podium and she said, you know, a year ago I lost my husband. And when I lost him, I lost half of my income. And I was so afraid that I was going to be rendered homeless. And she said, I just didn't know what I was going to do. I was desperate. I was thinking I was going to be sleeping on somebody's couch, or I was not going to be sleeping anywhere but a car, because I'd lost so much of my income. And she's a fixed income senior. Social Security pays, what, $15,000 a year right now, maybe 16. They might have just gotten a raise, according to my father. But Annie was standing there, and she said, you know, a friend of mine told me to apply for this housing, right? 4,500 applications. And she said, and I won. She said, you know, and I honestly feel like this was a miracle, that this was an act of God. And I remember standing there listening to her say that, and I thought to myself, well, no, not exactly an act of God, but maybe one step removed. If you think that whatever deity you pray to works through people, and this housing that you're living in is an act of people. It comes from good policy, it comes from good planning, it comes from political will, and it comes from the money to build affordable housing. So those are the 4 things that I think that we really need. And that is what we spend all of our time trying to figure out how to do. And it's why, as my original board chair once said to me, you can go off and build your little housing units, but if you don't engage in public policy to get the kind of policy that you need, you will never, ever be able to meet the problem at scale. And we as a state in California have for far too long left a statewide goal up to localities and let them close their borders. We have not allowed or even thought that housing was in our best economic interest as a state. Well, look at what's happening to California right now. Tesla just left. Chevron is talking about leaving. We have big companies talking about relocating their corporate headquarters out of our state. And when you ask them why, because it's cheaper, even though our regulatory framework is a little crazy, it's cheaper for their employees to live in other states. And we actually had net out migration in San Francisco. There's a 35% office vacancy rate right now in downtown San Francisco. It is in our best economic interest to have good statewide housing policy in every state in the country. And so that's what we've been working on. That's what I've been working on at Eden through the Housing Consortium, through our regional groups. And I know Jennifer Lassar is here. She's on the board of Up for Growth, and she and I did a thing called the Committee to House the Bay Area. It was like 2 years of torture, but we ended up with some really interesting laws, not the least of which was a little thing called the State Surplus Land Act, which says that any piece of land that's owned publicly when it's disposed of by a city has to actually have a priority for housing. And so we're starting to see our significant sites coming through that are zoned for housing, that have 25% minimum housing thresholds, that the state itself on its own land is actually zoning themselves. So I have a property in Marin County, which might be the hardest place on the planet to get something approved. I know because I spent 10 years getting something approved there. It's zoned by the state of California. And so we are going to get our approvals at the state level by the state of California. We will still get sued by every land use lawyer that lives in Marin because they don't want this project to go forward. But we really, really have done a lot of work in California to create new laws. So we've done a lot of by right work on sites. And there's now a predisposition for city councils to vote yes. We have this little thing called the Housing Accountability Act, which basically says to the cities, if it's in your housing element and you've zoned for it, you're going to have a really hard time saying no. So we have cities voting yes now because they have to. And when you ask the council members like why they like that law, they'll be like, well, because I can like shrug my shoulders and say, well, if we don't do it, a judge is going to make us do it. And if a judge makes us do it, we might not get the results we want. So we're better off working with the proponents to get this done. It still does not shut down the litigation stuff that we see in California. So there's a report that was released last week, 2 weeks ago by Holland and Knight, Jennifer Hernandez. We have, I would say, the mother of all Environmental Quality Act laws that is truly a weaponized NIMBY option. And if you have 3 hours, I'll tell you my NIMBY story later. But anybody can sue you anytime for any development, and it will take you 3 years to get through the courts. And the problem with CEQA is that it was originally intended to save sensitive environmental aspects of California, and now people just use it to hold you up or shut you down. And we have to stop that. So even in a situation where the council votes yes unanimously, you can still be sued, and you can still go to court for several years. And that, if you're me and you build affordable housing, seriously changes your economics and your dynamics. But you know, I think we've done a lot of work in California. I know we have questions about this, so I'm not going to tell you the whole story. But you know, I think it's really, I don't like to use bullets anymore because I'm just kind of sensitive to all the gun stuff. But it is not a single solution. It took us decades to build ourselves into the problem we're in California, and it's going to take us decades to build ourselves out. So that's my short intro to California.
Thank you. A lot of different insight on the panel. I just had a new policy analyst in New York who's moved to Philadelphia. So because she couldn't find anywhere to live in New York City. So she's commuting from Philly right now. I wonder if we could just sort of go back to those basics, and if anyone on the panel could just talk about more the expression of the underproduction, like what issues is it really causing for your work? I know you said that companies are literally leaving the state. Could you talk a little more about sort of the expression of this issue?
Well, I think, you know, in California, the extreme expression is the homeless counts, right? I mean, we have the highest number of homeless or unhoused people in the country. It's more than 150,000 people. We have significant challenges with where are people going to live, how are they going to live. People are living in cars, they're couch surfing, they're living in tents, and we really don't have a solid solution there, right? So that's the extreme expression at the human level. You know, and we have, you know, 2,000 households on our waiting list. We could probably have 82,000, but we cut our waiting list off at 5 years, right? So if we think it's going to take you 5 years to move from the bottom to the top, that list is closed. And so daily we get calls around, how can I find a house? It's really vexing. And when you talk to people, everybody gets it. Our employers are our best allies. One of the projects we're working on is in Livermore, which is a big wine appellation in California. It's east of Oakland. They grow a lot of great grapes out there. The wineries have been our biggest ally in our latest project because they have no place for their workers to go.
Right.
And so a lot of companies will say this. I have challenges as an employer. We have 500 staff people. It's really challenging to hire, and we're feeling a lot of salary pressure, right? So it's great. It's great. We're raising wages, but at some point, there's a limit there to what's feasible. And so, I think it's really a big challenge. Southern California has the same problem, but it's got kind of more places to go. So I think that it's a little bit easier. But it's putting a ton of economic pressure on the state, the housing challenge.
So when I saw the study in July, I did a double take. I thought just 4 million or 3.8 million homes. I thought it'd be 10 or something like that. I do numbers. We have 130 million-ish homes in the U.S. We're short 4 million homes. Let's round the number up. That's about 3%. What if 3% of our existing housing stock, probably single-family detached homes, what if they all added 1 unit, an ADU or a duplex or something? The home I saw you, the home that we bought in Alexandria, had 2 other units in it. It's pre-done for putting those back in. What if just 3% of all the homes in the U.S. added a unit internal to the existing structure? There wouldn't be technically a housing under production. But there's another issue too that we didn't get into in that report that we will try to get into, and that's the underproduction by type. We're probably overproduced in some housing, right? We're probably way underproduced in other housing. And if you took the extremes, that's the real number I'm looking for. We could have a 10 million home swing at the extremes. So I think that's the second part of the study I hope they undertake in the next year or so.
Becca, on that topic, the sort of ADUs and like giving more flexibility to homeowners, is that something that you address through the preservation world? And like how do you sort of see similar value and what shared goal, like increasing supply but also stabilizing?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the work that our members do is related to aging in place, and we support anything that makes that possible. I'm a certified aging in place specialist, and a lot of times people think aging in place means staying in the same home for 30 years, but it doesn't. It means living in the home where you want to be. Maybe that's closer to your children, or maybe it's at the beach or whatever. But anything that makes that possible, I think, absolutely helps, for sure. And of course, yeah, and I think you had another interesting topic we didn't end up discussing yet about the pairing younger people living with older people.
Yeah, Chris, did you want to talk about that? There's a state level program, right, that allowed young people to reside with seniors.
Well, that's interesting. It hasn't really bubbled up in a meaningful number yet, but what I'm seeing is a trend towards a grandchild moving in and being the caregiver for the grandparent, with the agreement being that when the grandparent passes on, that house reverts to the grandchild. And it's a growing number, but it's very small still. But the baby boomers, which is the huge generation that I'm part of, we're going to be swamping the system, the caregiving system, starting later this decade and going through the 2040s. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that grandchild-grandparent relationship emerging over the next 10 or so years.
Can I just add, I think ADUs are a really important solution, and particularly to this particular challenge. And I know in San Jose, when we started looking at the ADU law in California, the Turner Center did a study of how many lots, if you'd put ADUs on every lot that could take one, you could build 60,000 units. That's a huge piece of a solution. And I think what we're seeing in ADUs, and I actually...
That's in San Diego.
No, it's San Jose.
San Jose.
San Jose. And it's interesting because I actually think ADUs and upzoning single-family neighborhoods to be duplexes or triplexes is a really important part of the solution for California, but it also solves for this, right? It solves for the multi-generational, how am I going to deal with my parents? How am I going to deal with my kids? Like, a lot of kids are moving back home right now, right? Because they have no place to go because they can't afford their own house. And I actually have some friends who've moved out and left the house to the kids, and they've downsized to another state because they're like, how do I help my kid get into this market, right? So, but I think the ADUs are super important. But the thing that they're not is they're not restricted by income. And so they're not necessarily solving the low-income challenge.
Do you in your work see this issue that Chris is talking about with the mismatch between what we're able to build, which is often sort of policy driven, and what the actual demographic demand is? And is it something you have to wrestle with? And what are the barriers that you face if you're trying to respond to that demographic change?
I think the biggest challenge we have is that we have no place for people to move to in affordable housing. So if you move in with Eden, you can stay with us forever, right? And if you want to do that, that's great, but you have no place to go if your income goes up and you've saved enough money to buy a house. There is no first-time homebuyer option in the Bay Area. The median home price is $1 million for a house. And so if your income is $85,000 a year, you're not buying a house anywhere near where we are. And I think that's we're super supply constrained in the middle, and we're extremely supply constrained for first-time home buyers in California. You have to move very far out. I know this because my staff do this. They move to San Joaquin County, they go to Fresno, they go to Bakersfield. They're going out further and further, and I think that's a challenge for the Inner Bay because people want to be able to own a home. Different family types have different housing needs, and we don't have enough distribution. We build a ton of SROs. Like single room occupancy, small size, one bedroom apartments. There's a lot of that, and there's a lot of that that's very expensive, but we're not really trying to build enough for a family type, and that's a big challenge for us.
So it's the range. Chris, I wonder, you talk a lot about the different states' innovations in this stuff, but I wonder if have you seen any examples of it actually playing out yet, or is it too early, a lot of this policy innovation around trying to have more diverse household types and do more sort of subtle increasing density?
You have an hour? Let me talk about Minneapolis that I only briefly mentioned. Minneapolis was sort of the first major city to get rid of the single in family zoning. And so they allow up to 3 units in single family residential areas. They didn't go to 4 units because they got neighborhood pushback. But in my view, the 4 units is really where the market is. So I talked to a very good friend of mine who works for the Metro Council about the effectiveness of the Minneapolis law and how many units have been built. Well, a few dozen after 2 years. That's not a lot, and so what's going on? The industry has to figure it out. And it's tricky to retrofit a single-family home into a duplex or a triplex. It may sound easy, but it's surprisingly not easy. I don't know why, even though I did used to build. But it's all markets. And so he was laying out some structural reasons why that regulation has to be modified, expanded, made more flexible. Going to Oregon statewide, most housing units built in Oregon since that law was passed just 3 years ago now, have been multifamily. That's a big change, and now Oregon has the growth management and everything else, but that's a big number when you see most of the new housing being attached. Utah is too new. That was passed in 2021, but I have friends there all throughout the state. And they're thinking about ways, they know people think about ways in which to implement the law. California is really interesting. They've had ADUs by right for almost 10 years now in various forms. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a whole cottage industry that's GIS driven. So in the Bay Area, you can pull down your property, as I mentioned earlier, and fit a new ADU either inside the house or on the property. And the numbers are out there, 20,000 new ADUs per year in California statewide. I did some study in St. Petersburg, Florida. No, I'm sorry, Clearwater, Florida. They've had an ADU policy for 10, 15 years, And they did an analysis of it, and they found all the reasons why they needed to expand or make more flexible that law. So like all cities, when they start doing ADUs, they worry about parking. What's going to happen to the parking on the street? Not a problem in Clearwater. What about building height? Not a problem in Clearwater. What about tiny homes on backyards and side yards? Not a problem. So they're going through all of these second generation thinking processes about how to tweak their ADU ordinance to make it more flexible. And it's not just an ADU, it's up to 2 additional units on the property, which is also similar to what Seattle is doing. Now, all of these, except for Clearwater, all of these are within 5 years. But I'm actually quite hopeful that by the end of this decade, we're going to see a pretty massive cottage industry in metropolitan areas who have figured this out and make it work.
Can I just also make a point about 2 and 3 family homes? You know, I lived in Boston for a very long time. I rented from my Irish landlady who rented the 2nd floor to her 18 children and the 3rd floor to me and my friend. And it was really a way for her to own her own home and secure her own tenure. And we talk a lot about wealth building and single family homes and what that means and how most people of color in this country are left behind in that spectrum. But I'll tell you, a 2 or a 3 family home is a really great way to figure out a way to buy a house and support your mortgage with rent to somebody else. And I think we're not thinking about just how powerful this could be in so many cities for home ownership and for small landlords. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, there's a group, the Cambridge Neighborhood Apartment Housing Services Group. They literally help train small landlords to be small landlords. You know, I think this is a really important housing type, and it's a really good housing type. And I think people have this fear in their head about, oh, it's going to be terrible. I'm like, I lived in it. I loved living in 3 family houses. It was low scale. My landlady was right downstairs. If I had a problem, I knew who to call. I could walk to the BART station. Oh, sorry, in that state it was the T station. I'm translating. But I think that is so important, and we don't think about it as a wealth builder for folks who are being completely left out of the homeownership game right now in this country.
Good point.
Becca, what would your sort of dream policy innovations be to support your work? Like, what do you need for preservation, and does it need to sort of be a federal movement? Do you mostly sort of, would you be advocating for state or local support? And I was also interested if you do work when it's sort of homes have gone so far that they're actually, people don't live in them and they're boarded up, which seems to be like obviously the extreme version of people needing home repair, but it's a different issue because you've even got to get someone who could live there.
Great questions. Like, I'll do the last one first.
Okay.
So, yes, sometimes a home is too far gone, and at that point, we advise our members not to renovate it, but to build a replacement home. And so sometimes it happens with disaster recovery, so most of our groups are doing just repairs, but a lot of them are starting to do new construction, but it's on land that's already owned by the family, and it's a replacement home like that. So that we're seeing some of that. I mean, it doesn't always make sense to repair. It can cost a lot more to repair it if it gets to that point than just to replace it. In terms of what we're looking for, certainly we always want more money, so we advocate, of course, for more funding for the few federal programs I mentioned for USDA, but really what we're seeing is that there's just so many challenges to nonprofits accessing the funds that are already there, and so we're working a lot with USDA on how to make it easier to work with, and so whether it's reducing the amount of paperwork, for example, it's the same like 26-page application to get a big loan to build a new home as it is to get a $7,500 grant. And so it's really difficult to get, elderly woman in West Virginia to be willing to fill out all these forms that have, federal, they're just not interested in that. And also I think making sure that the funding that's available and the caps on grant size and the loan size, that's increasing as inflation's happening. So with the 504 home loan and grant program, the grant has been capped at $7,500 for a really long time. Well, that does not go nearly as far as it used to. And so making sure those numbers are tied to something that, is increasing because the needs are just getting bigger and bigger, and the amount that covers is getting smaller and smaller.
Right. Linda, similarly, could you talk about some of the difficulties with availability of financing? Do you classify that as like a major barrier to being able to do more multifamily from your side, or is it less the financing, more cost of land, zoning?
Kind of all the above, right? We're in a super high cost area. Unfortunately, I just saw this article from the San Francisco Chronicle that said that the affordable housing price to build in San Francisco, where Eden actually doesn't work, was weighed in at $1.2 million a unit this morning, which is overwhelming to me. So we're coming in at about $600,000 a unit right now, $600 to $800 in the non-sort of core city areas. So it's all of it, right? Land is expensive, building is expensive. We work in a publicly financed environment, which means we are meeting everybody's public objectives. And I have no problems with that, but don't kid yourself. There's real cost to building housing that is the greenest housing, that uses labor that gets the best wages, right? So I think you have to be realistic about, the more you put on in a public policy arena onto a single house, the more it's going to cost you. And so that's all there. We're not, and it takes a long time. From conception to construction start for Eden right now, we're looking at 5 years. So if somebody calls me up tomorrow and says, I have project A I want to do with you, it's a long time. So the one cost we've been able to really work on is land. So free land is great. So we were just talking about the Surplus Land Act, which Jennifer and I have talked about for a long time. So that land comes to us at deep discounts, right? If you're building 100% affordable, you usually get it for $0. And we have a lot of inclusionary ordinances in California, which are illegal in some states, I recognize. But in California, in the Bay Area in particular, almost every jurisdiction has said to their for-profit home builders, you figure out a way to deliver 15 to 20% affordable housing. And what they typically do is give us land for free. Mm-hmm. And so not free to them, but free to us. So that helps our cost constructs. But it's been really hard to think of ways to reduce costs. We did our first modular project with Factory OS out of Vallejo. And it came in just slightly less expensive than stick-built, but where we really saved is on time, and with interest rates going up, saving several months' worth of interest it really matters. I think if we scaled modular for multifamily, we could have some substantial savings, but I think it's going to be a while before we can get enough scale there. But it's just the cost construct is crazy. And then in California, we have these sort of boom and bust budgets, right? And so in years where we're doing really great, the state gives us a lot of money to build affordable housing, and in years where we're not doing so great, the state takes it all away. And so we haven't really had a consistent set of investments. The last few years, the state has been incredibly generous. They've been investing billions in affordable housing and really focusing on homelessness as well. So we've been doing things like buying hotels and motels and converting them, buying commercial office buildings and converting them, and thinking about ways to do things that are different. And that was actually maybe the silver lining of the pandemic, is that we had this one program that all of a sudden said, well, how can we house people more quickly? And so Project Home Key is our project in California to buy, and I know a lot of other states are doing the same thing, but it really accelerated. You can buy housing a whole lot faster than you can build it in the markets that we work in.
That's great. I mean, we're so behind in New York. We're sort of on paper trying to do those things, but the zoning, the regulatory impediments are just so stubborn. We can't even really get a hotel to residential conversion. They can't even conceptualize it just because of the internal zoning barriers.
I think zoning, I never underestimate zoning as a problem, right? I think that that's really the challenge. We went after AB 2011, which was the commercial conversion law, for exactly that reason. We're seeing huge shopping malls shrink their footprints, right? We're seeing office buildings that have vacancies. I don't know about you guys, but my staff are never coming back to work 5 days a week. If I make them, I'm going to have mass exodus. Mm-hmm. So my office footprint's probably not going to get a whole lot bigger in the next couple of years. And I think if we are not thinking about commercial adaptation, we're missing a major opportunity in this country to put some housing into some really important locations.
I mean, on that topic, you sort of talked about potential battles between the state concepts of housing policy and then cities within the states, and like that battleground. I wonder if you have any examples of where there's sort of attempts to remedy underproduction at either the state level or the city level, and and sort of what we can do about that relationship. I mean, we're certainly facing in New York, the city is not doing really anything on zoning reform for ADUs, especially on the parking side, and then the state says they'll take over local zoning, and it's a huge controversy. So could you just talk about that relationship and how should that be as smooth as possible for trying to deal with underproduction? Yes, Chris.
So I'm following 3 states, maybe 4. No, I'm not following California as early as I should, but you're there. So, so in Utah, what I'm finding more often than not is the legislatures are more in tune to the housing problems than the cities.
That's what it is. Yeah, it's crazy.
And it didn't used to be the case.
Right.
And so in Utah, which is a very red state, the legislature there said to the cities, which are very exclusionary as a whole, some exceptions, they basically told the cities, you're going to have ADUs, and you're going to, it'll be mandatory. And the cities came back hat in hand begging for some flexibility, which they got some of, but in Utah, it was the legislature that said, you are going to have this. Earlier this year in Arizona, the legislature almost passed a law that would take the word single out of family zoning and allow up to 8 plexes by right on individual single-family lots. The League of Cities and Towns in Arizona went to the legislature begging, please give us a year. So there's been a study committee. I'm sort of helping that committee think things through, along with many other people. But I would not be surprised if the next session, 2023, the legislature basically tells cities, you're going to have 4-plex minimum on every single family lot. Same in Oregon. And California is doing not quite that, but they have a very flexible ADU law, and now they're doing other things in California. I haven't seen so much in the East, and it's not because I'm not paying attention. I used to live in the South, and I used to live here. So except for maybe New Hampshire, they're actually doing something. Mm-hmm. But I haven't seen a whole lot east of the Rockies.
I would say, just because I'm an alumni of Massachusetts, right, they have Chapter 40B, right, which is a really powerful law, and we looked at that for California and modeled SB 35, which is our sort of by right expedited, if you have a certain percentage of housing that's affordable and you meet certain fairly well-defined tests, you get a get out of CEQA jail-free card, essentially.
We're trying to get that in New York.
Doesn't necessarily mean you won't get sued, but 40B is great, right? Because if you don't have enough affordable housing in your town and a proponent comes forward with a certain project that's got a certain percentage of affordable housing, you got to build that town X. And in Massachusetts, it's been enormously powerful, and they have this really interesting feature, which is the voluntary feature. So I could go forward with a project voluntarily in that state. In California, SB 35, I have to decide to use it. So I, the developer, have to go into City A and say, okay, City A, I want to use SB 35, but I still have to go back to that city to get approvals to get local funding to support the affordable housing. So I'm not really immune from the public hearing process. Mm-hmm. And so it's not quite smooth sailing, but we're seeing a lot more by right expedited approvals, particularly for projects that are 100% affordable. It's not lawsuit proof, which in California is kind of a big deal, and there's a couple of provisions in our expediting. But I think California's worked really hard at this. So we in California have a law that requires all of the cities to plan for their housing needs. It's called Housing Element Law. So every city has to tell you, here's how I'm going to meet the needs that are assigned to my city. They don't necessarily have to do it, but they tell you how many units they're going to build all over California. And we did this thing in 2016 when Governor Brown passed the housing bonds. He said he would do it if we did some things like SB 35. We also had this little tiny law that we thought up one day to have the Attorney General enforce housing element law. And it's been incredibly powerful. The AG has written letters to cities that are trying to get around certain rules in housing elements. You may have read about the mountain lion, the endangered mountain lion. So there's a little city called Woodside that decided that they didn't have to build any affordable housing in certain areas because of the endangered species. They got a letter from the Attorney General and they immediately changed course, right? So it's been very powerful. They issued letters to Huntington Beach and to several other cities. And so now the cities are like, wow, if we don't do this, if we don't do something, we are gonna be in the sights of either a public interest group that wants to sue us or potentially the Attorney General. And so that's actually kind of an interesting thing.
I used to write housing elements for California, and they never went anywhere.
That's right.
Good for you.
Yeah, that's so great. Becca, do you have any instances where the states are kind of leading the way in terms of supporting preservation? Does it still tend to be like more local support?
It really depends. I guess South Carolina, there's been some good partnerships that we've seen there. I don't know. I mean, we have 100 members spread over 50 states, so we don't have a lot of concentration in any one state to say, but we're trying to encourage more and more collaboration between municipalities and our nonprofits, and when we see best practices happening in one place, to try to make sure the next town or city or state over knows, actually, you can use that for this. Even you think about the ARPA funds, some cities have figured out, oh, you can use that for home repairs, and others are like, no, you can't use that for repairs. Well, yes, you can. Actually, it's written in the law, you can. And so trying to share that and make sure that the good ideas are spreading everywhere.
And what do you feel like are some of you sort of talk, there's a slightly shifting messaging, and I think Up for Growth is like a big contributor to that, about how to talk about reform to sort of break exclusion and to try and change zoning and to try and break the NIMBY argument. And Linda, you said that maybe the messaging about companies leaving and the economic argument seems to be a strong one. Could you talk maybe about what you all think the strongest messaging is for something like, I know in Minneapolis they really led with racial equity as the driver for low density, getting rid of single family, and that was a very strong message. So what do you feel like are the strongest messages where deep levels of community engagement could end up, really wanting to protect parking spaces rather than the home? What's the best way to try and break those?
I think the message depends on the state. Mm-hmm. And I could be wrong, I hope I am wrong, I think the message will be different in each state or each place. I used to have relatives in Minnesota. I would call the Minneapolis solution collective Lutheran guilt.
Right.
And they just felt they had to do something because they were not doing the right thing. And that's for real in that part of the country. In Utah, it was, what about our kids? Where are they going to live? And in Oregon, to prevent suburbanization of the farmlands and forests, we've got to densify urban areas. And that's a proactive cultural perspective in Oregon. In Arizona, it's more libertarian. It's you shouldn't exclude people,
right,
because that's actually anti-libertarian by excluding people. So every message that I've seen is a little different.
I don't know, for California, I don't think you have to convince anybody that we have a housing problem anymore. Mm-hmm. I mean, we have seen record numbers of housing bills coming forward in our legislature in the last 5 years, so many that it's actually hard to parse all of them, and a handful of really tight ones are getting through. The opposition is coming from places you would not expect, and it's been really interesting. I think there's a real disconnect between getting something done at the state level and passing a piece of legislation and actually getting a project done at the local level. And I think everybody is all for fixing the housing problem until you bring that project to their neighborhood. And then you still have a problem getting that project approved in California. And I think, the by right, and I'm just going to give a shout out to San Diego because they did a lot of by right site identification as a city. They went through their entire transit corridor. We have a project there that is going to be done in record time because they basically approved our zoning administratively. There's like no hearings. That is a godsend for us in California. We actually have another law that limits hearings to 5 because some localities can take you to 25 hearings left unfettered. And that law has been super important to us, right? And so the things we've had to fix in California to solve for the NIMBY piece in local neighborhoods, and I would say this, the better the school district, the harder the approvals process. And the secret weapon in California is they can take your project to the ballot at the local level if they don't like it. And so no matter how well you do, if the city's making any kind of legislative act, they can undo you at the ballot. And In Palo Alto, which is home to Stanford University, I have a colleague who tried to build 60 units of senior housing. They took that project to the ballot because it was going to be just, I don't know what it was going to be, too much of a threat to the neighborhood, and then they built 20 very wealthy homes with probably 3 times more cars than the senior housing would have had. But it was pretty crazy. And, you know, we at Eden, we can't withstand a ballot challenge. That's $1 million. You know, running a campaign at a local level, you just, it's hard to combat that. And what people say they like in theory and what their yard sign says is very different from how they vote when it's in their neighborhood, right? And that's not everybody. I know it's a sweeping statement, but it feels true to me this month in a very visceral way.
We don't deal with zoning really at all because we're dealing with properties that already exist, but
Yeah.
Our members are talking a lot about racial equity, and one shift we're starting to see is that most of our members historically have only served homeowners, and realizing that, you know, homeownership rates for people of color are lower than white people, and so trying to figure out how to responsibly repair renter homes. I say responsibly because if you are a nonprofit that's providing free repairs or very low cost repairs for a slumlord who could afford to do it themselves, that's, you know, not a great investment. But figuring out how to deal with all the logistics, getting the lease amendments, and, you know, it takes more time. But we are seeing a shift, and more of our members are willing to explore how to repair rental homes instead of just homeowners, because specifically wanting to focus on the racial equity of the clients they're serving.
Right. I think we're at, yeah, should we see if there's any audience questions? I don't know if we do that.
Yes, if there are audience questions, we'd love to. Maybe like you guys got very caught up in listening to the conversation amongst, like you said in the beginning, academic and the practitioners. But we do have a few minutes. Are there any, if there are questions? Oh.
Thank you. Will Viederman, I'm from the Housing Authority of New Haven, Connecticut. Very different type of housing problem, housing crisis than a lot of the more Western folks. And Sarah, I would love to hear from you. To Chris's point, there's a big difference between some of the action on the West Coast and the East Coast right now. In a place like New York, which has huge shortages up for growth, similarly a place like New Haven, very built out, 77% multifamily already. What are the paths to scaling up production at the size that needs to be, where there's not a lot of like little gentle density changes that can be made?
I mean, I could argue that there's lots of gentle density changes that can be made in New York City. We need zoning reform for the multifamily, so I would argue we need to make our density controls less restrictive. So we can allow more units internally. We actually have an average of, through our zoning, I think it's still 600 square foot or something, so you have to balance it out. The density factor, whatever architects know the technical names, we definitely need reform on that. We can't build small studios. You can't build small studios still. So all the singles are coming in and just renting the family units and distorting the market. They create fake high household incomes. So everyone then argues that we need family housing, but if you don't tackle the single, half the population of New York single, and there's literally no options for them. So I think the interior of our multifamilies can be denser. We're trying to pursue a zoning bonus for affordable housing, and then we have loads of pushback against neighborhood rezonings, but we could still do lots of neighborhood rezonings, both in high opportunity neighborhoods. There was a pitch battle about rezoning Soho. People are against the rezoning of low-income neighborhoods, and then people are against the rezoning of high-opportunity neighborhoods, or for both different reasons. But that certainly needs to happen more in New York City. But we have a lot of single-family homes. So much of Staten Island, Queens. We have a lot of existing basement apartments in our stock, where the number of units on the lot isn't the restriction, because we already have a lot of 2, 3, 4 family districts. But it's sort of, to a lot of people, panelists have talked today, it's just then you need to be doing policy that the homeowner can deal with, because it's then a homeowner rather than a multifamily owner. Because we are a multifamily city, I think we the policy mechanism, our framework, they know sort of how to deal with the big multifamily players, but none of our regulations work for the owner of a small building. And so it's so complicated, like it's almost impossible for a homeowner to get a basement apartment converted, even though the zoning, I mean, parking is a restriction, but the number of units is not our restriction in that situation. So you need like homeowner-oriented policies, and I think there has been a lot of innovation that New York needs to learn from for that. But we do also have single-family homes, and like we need to allow them to have ADUs, and we're really behind in New York on that. And in terms of if you work for the Public Housing Authority, I mean, we're doing a lot of work. Was it the Public Housing Authority you work with? In terms of, declining stock, we're almost in uninhabitable conditions in New York City's public housing. And that is going to be a mass loss of supply that houses 500,000 people. And it's been chronically underinvested and nothing been done for 30 years on it. And we're doing a lot of work to try and do New York's version of the RAD conversions to bring in private sector money, but done in the right way, by letting the tenants be the drivers of the planning process. So we've now got the public housing residents for the first time are able to pick their private developer, pick their general contractor, architect, new property manager. And so it's trying to like twist the dynamic of privatization and actually put residents in the driving seat. And once they're actually more interested in like, well, what private partners can we work with? And actually more interested in potential demolition and rebuild, because if they have faith that they're actually the drivers in it, they're more open to different avenues to try and deal with that issue. But that's a major problem facing actually like losing supply in New York. With just terrible conditions.
So we have time for one more question. And
Sure. I'll make a quick one. David Hunter with National Community Stabilization Trust. In terms of federal resources, Becca, you mentioned the USDA, the 504 and 533, and asking for changes that would help to streamline and flow that money more so better. Are there other federal programs that you or Linda would like to see that happen with? And I'm thinking about that in the context of the Housing Supply Action Plan, which calls for updating regs on a number of programs.
We've been pretty narrowly focused on those two programs. I'll just add that there's an opportunity for there to be a loan packaging grant that goes to the nonprofit. Right now you can have that, but it's attached to the loan, so the homeowner ends up paying it. So a lot of nonprofits don't charge it, but there is a separate section that already exists that where the federal government would fund that $500 packaging grant, but it's not been funded for many, many years. So we're trying to push that through, because I think more and more nonprofits would be willing to be the loan packager and get it through, because USDA is understaffed. I mean, it's not going to happen if you try to go through there. So that's one other thing we're looking at.
Yeah, don't get me started on 504. We don't only have a small portion, 6 years to close a refi transaction with USDA, and we just finally got it done. I won't even go there, because I think the home program is the one that needs the most reform. I think it's a program that was sort of structured 3 decades ago now, that really needs some updating and modernization to better match with the tax credit, to allow you to refinance and preserve older properties. And to have more clarity on the regs. So in California, we have the state interprets home one way, the localities do it differently, and I think just getting more clarity there. And frankly, I like some of the HUD, like 202, some of those production programs, which are now coming back, I think have been really important, but thinking about ways to use them more nimbly than the way they've been used in the past, I think would be really helpful to states like California, because it just takes HUD a long time, and we are in a tax credit environment that moves really quickly. And so having programs that we can better pair with the tax credit. Honestly, I'll tell you, the tax credit is being used for every single affordable unit we're producing in California right now. And we've used some of the state funding the federal relief funding to do accelerated funding to replace credits, because we don't have enough credits to go around. But I think on the homeless side, we force those units to use a debt model that can't take any debt. So we should be doing some kind of expedited direct granting to do some of this homeless housing and just get the stuff done. Like, just build it and figure out a way to do it faster. I think HomeKey is the model for that. Give me the grant to buy the motel. Give me the grant to renovate the motel, give the tenants the money to pay the rent for the foreseeable future, because it's not going to happen any differently, and really come up with a way to serve the tenants' mental health needs. I think the one thing this country's not doing well enough in the homeless side of the equation is understanding that people need services and working to move the health services into a better alignment with the housing work. And a lot of us are doing this individually at the county level, but it's hard. The regulatory environments, it's like speaking two languages. So I think there's a lot of basket of work, and I'm not Corporation for Supportive Housing. I'm sure they could write you a book on that, but I feel like that space, if you're serving people who are having significant challenges, we just got to get better at that. And it's a lot of it's a medical model that we're putting onto a landlord that has no capacity to manage that. So it's my short answer to a long question.
I think we're done with time. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you to our panelists, Belinda, Becca, and Chris. Thank you.